The death of Queen Elizabeth I of England in the year 1603 triggered a series of events that brought to a head a debate that had been simmering among the English Puritans for the better part of the previous 50 years. That debate being whether further reform of the church in England was possible, and if so, how was it best achieved? It eventually came down to a choice between continuing to work for reform from within the church or withdrawing from the established church and starting all over again, even if that meant, as it likely did, having to leave England. By the 1620s, conditions were such that considerable numbers of those Reformed Christians had decided to do just that, had decided to leave England, or as they put it, to make haste out of Babylon, leaving for more hospitable climes in Europe or even the distant New World. But most of those who left, even those who sailed across the Atlantic Ocean to what would be called New England, had not completely given up on the hope of reforming the church back in England. And indeed, they sought in the new land to further the cause of reform back home by creating among them a model society. Not just to talk about, but to demonstrate what in fact was possible. And possible not just for those back home in England, but for the world. And nowhere was that goal expressed more powerfully than in the words of the leader of one of the first groups to sail for America, a man named John Winthrop, who upon arriving in Boston in the year 1630 would become the first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. We've printed on our bulletin cover today the closing portion of a sermon that he delivered to his fellow immigrants aboard the ship Arbella as they sailed across the Atlantic Ocean, where he speaks of the dream of their building together a new society, a city upon a hill for all the eyes of the world to see. It's no coincidence whatsoever that Winthrop should have borrowed that famous phrase from the words of Jesus. From the words of Jesus in that portion of the Gospel of Matthew that we know as the Sermon on the Mount. Because that sermon, too, are words that were largely spoken to a small group of committed disciples who had themselves withdrawn from the world in order to reform the world. Here in Matthew, Jesus, just like Winthrop, urges his disciples to lead a life that would be a living demonstration of a redeemed humanity for others to see. And he emphasizes here, contrary to what some seemed to be thinking, that he was not in any way lowering the standards for his followers, diminishing the demands of the law. To the contrary, Jesus was raising the standards expected of his followers, asking them to adopt a way of life, a measure of righteousness that was far more demanding than that of the world around them, even than that of the religious leaders of his day. For his followers were called to be the salt of the earth, the light of the world, a city upon a hill for all the world to see, for all the world to see what was possible. The challenge that Jesus laid before his disciples that day in the Sermon on the Mount was in many ways the same challenge that the prophet Isaiah lay before the Judeans who had returned from their exile in Babylon. The same challenge that the Apostle Paul lay before the Christians in Corinth. The same challenge that John Winthrop lay before the English Puritans sailing to the New World. Indeed, it is the same challenge that has faced the people of God from the very beginning in our efforts to be faithful to God's call. And it is certainly the challenge that we are facing in the church today. And that is the challenge not just to talk about religion, no matter how eloquently, but to live it. The challenge not just to build soaring and magnificent houses of worship, but to build communities where life is pleasing to God. The challenge of not just going through the motions of worship, no matter how impressively we may do so, no matter even how beautifully or how sincerely, but actually to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly before our God. And the question now, just as it's always been, is how do you do that? How do you live such a life? How do you reform the church and society? Do you work from within, seeking to make it better one step at a time, or does there come a time when in some sense you just have to start all over again? It seems to me that these days we're actually getting very close to that point, if we haven't already reached it. With every passing day, the church in our society is less and less seen as an integral part of the community. We can no longer claim to any real degree to speak for the whole of American society, not because there are now so many other religions represented among us, though that, of course, is true, but because there are so many more people today who simply don't think of themselves as religious at all, as belonging to any faith community. There was a time when we could look upon American society as largely our creation, a society profoundly influenced by religious principles, but that's simply less and less true today. People say that the church needs to speak up. But the problem is that the church today has no voice, at least no voice that can be heard. Not because we're not speaking, but because no one much is listening. And the truth is, why should they? If the church is going to regain its voice, if the church is going to become once again a powerful and a positive influence upon our society, people are actually going to have a reason to listen to what the church has to say, then it's only going to happen by showing people something. Not just by talking or making sweeping and impressive declarations, but by actually doing something. Actually being something that makes people stop and take another look. That makes people stop and listen to what we have to say. In other words, by doing exactly what Jesus says here in Matthew, by being the salt of the earth, the light of the world, by building that city upon a hill, that model of redeemed humanity. But still, what does that mean? What would such a community look like? I'm not sure we would know even how to begin to answer that question, in large part because it's been so long since we had to ask it. Well, it was while I was thinking about these things earlier this week that I stumbled across an article that I didn't immediately associate with all this, but it was still a very interesting article. And the more I thought about it and the more I thought about its implications, the more relevant it began to seem to me in terms of this larger question. The article was actually an excerpt from a recently published book entitled The Triple Package: How Three Unlikely Traits Explain the Rise and Fall of Cultural Groups in America. I don't know if any of you have seen anything about this book. It was written by a husband and wife team of law school professors, one of whom achieved a good deal of notoriety a few years ago with another book she had written, which was called The Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother, a book about parenting habits that stirred up quite a ruckus at the time. And I suspect this new book will do the same, because it deals with a very sensitive issue, such a sensitive issue that we very seldom even admit to its existence: the phenomenon of why certain groups seem to be so much more successful than others. The thesis of these authors is that this phenomenon actually has nothing to do with genetics or anything like that, nor is it attributed to the innate superiority of some cultures over others. Instead, they contend it really all comes down to three basic principles, three things that are generally characteristic of all high-performing groups, including individual families. The first principle that they identify, and here I think they've chosen a very unfortunate term, because they call it a sense of superiority. I say that's unfortunate because what they're really saying is not so much a matter of thinking oneself better than others, superior in that sense, as much as it is simply having much higher expectations of oneself than is the norm in our society. That is to say, holding oneself to higher standards than others do, which, when you think about it, is pretty much exactly what Jesus does in the Sermon on the Mount. For throughout that sermon, as we will hear in the next 2 weeks, Jesus takes a rule beginning, "You have heard it said," and then he turns it up a notch. "But I say unto you." He never lowers the standard. He never makes it easier to be his follower. He always makes it harder and more challenging. So I'd suggest that we think about making the first rule of our city upon a hill that very thing, that we hold ourselves to the higher standard that Jesus demands from his followers. The second principle these authors identify, interestingly enough, though if you think about it, not so surprisingly, is a sense of inferiority. After all, if you hold yourself to a high enough standard, you may begin to think that you're constantly falling hopelessly short, that you can never live up to such high expectations, and therefore begin to feel doomed to failure. And that strikes me as a very real risk here. But it may turn out to be a risk that you have to run if you're going to have high expectations, not just of yourself, but of the community of which you're a part. So I'd suggest that we think about making that the second rule of our city upon a hill, that we honestly acknowledge our shortcomings, and we try, with God's help, always to do better. The third and final principle these authors identify in what they call high-performing cultures is something quite a bit different from the other two, but in practice something that is every bit as important and perhaps even more so. It's what they call impulse control, by which they simply mean the ability to resist temptation, thus being people who systematically sacrifice present gratification in pursuit of future attainment. In other words, the ability to say no, the ability to do without something even if you can afford it, the ability to sow now and then to wait patiently to reap the fruits of one's efforts, even if those fruits should fall to the next generation. Of course, there's nothing magic about this at all. It's as obvious as the nose on your face, and the Apostle Paul talked about it a great deal, as we will in fact see over the next few weeks. In fact, over the next few weeks, I want us to continue thinking along these lines. I want us to continue thinking about what it means to be the salt of the earth, the light of the world, what it means to go about building a city upon a hill. And I want us to think long and hard about what such a community would look like, and specifically what it would mean to hold ourselves to a higher standard, to hold ourselves accountable to those standards, and finally to begin to think long-term rather than always in the present. I think you'll find that both Jesus and Paul have a good deal to say to us. And that's what we're going to do for the next 2 weeks. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, to whom be all glory and honor, now and forevermore.